I'm going to try to help today and give you some ideas about who to talk to and what to ask, and then how to document your fraud inquiries that are required by the auditing standards. So let's give it a go. First up, who should we interview? Normally, if it's a small business, I'll interview the owner of the business. If it's a larger entity, I will try to interview the board chairman. Normally, larger organizations have a board, and I want to talk to the chairperson and see whether or not there's a potential for fraud. Now, as I'm talking to the chairperson, I'm trying to get their perspective on how they monitor the risk of theft. And some organizations don't really give it a lot of thought. Some organizations give it a great deal of thought. But from the chair's position, from his or her perspective, I want to know, are they thinking about the potential for theft? And then I'm going to ask the basic questions, and you'll see these as I talk about the different people that you can talk to. One, I'm going to ask, has fraud occurred? Two, I'm going to ask, are there any allegations of fraud? And then three, I'll ask, are you aware of any way that fraud or theft could occur? The next person I would talk to in management, and again, if it's a large company, I'm talking to the board chairperson, and then I'm talking to the chief executive officer. If it's a small company, I'm just talking to the owner. Now, with the chief executive officer, quite often I'll begin with higher level questions and then drill down toward the potential for theft or fraud. Now let me give you an example. I would begin by making a statement such as, hey, I notice your profits up $10 million this year. Tell me how that happened this year. What do you attribute that to? And so I'm asking these broader general questions, and then as we proceed in the interview, I'm moving toward the more detailed questions of whether or not fraud has occurred within the entity, and whether or not there's an allegation of fraud, and whether or not there are any ways that he or she is aware of that fraud could occur. Now let's talk about doing the fraud interviews at the transaction level. And I prefer this part of the fraud interview, honestly, because I like to get into the nitty-gritty of how accounting works within the business. For example, I might interview the accounts payable supervisor, and I'm doing my normal walkthrough for that transaction area. What I do is I try to do the walkthrough and the fraud interview at the same time. And the reason being, I don't want to do my walkthrough and then wait 2 weeks and come back to the same person and say, oh, I forgot to talk to you about, the fraud issues. So I do the walkthrough. I'm asking questions such as, who issues purchase orders? Who signs the checks? Who's authorized to sign checks? Who reconciles the bank statement? Who enters the invoices in the general ledger? I'm doing those normal questions about accounts payable processing, our walkthrough. And as I'm doing so, I'm checking out the design and the implementation of the internal controls in that transaction area. When I get toward the end of that conversation, that's when I transition into my fraud interview. And based on what I've just seen, I probably already have a feel for whether or not there's a situation where theft could occur. But hey, I'm going to ask the question anyway. Is there any way that fraud could occur from your perspective, and then I let them respond. It's better to ask an open-ended question such as that one. Are there any ways that fraud might occur that you're aware of, rather than asking a question such as, did fraud occur this year? And they say yes or no. Now you need to ask that question, did fraud occur this year? But what I'm saying to you is you will get more information about the way the system works when you ask an open-ended question such as, is there any way that fraud could occur? So I'm going to ask a question like that. I'm also going to ask, did fraud occur during the year? Now that's a yes or no, and that's fine, but we need to ask that. And then finally I need to ask whether or not there were any allegations of fraud that, have you heard anybody in the hallway talking about fraud occurring in the company? Additionally, I'd like to reach out to other people that are not involved in accounting at all, such as the sales supervisor. You can learn a lot about the business by stepping outside of the traditional accounting roles and talking to people such as in sales or maybe in production. So how many people should you talk to? I've given you several potentials here. Normally I will interview at least 3 different people. It really depends on the size of the organization in terms of how many people you talk to, but you do need to make sure you get the view of those charged with governance. So you guys go through peer review, right? And what you're thinking about is, hey, I want to make sure I do the documentation right so that I don't get gigged by the peer reviewer. So let's talk about that. Most forms providers such as PPC or McGladrey or CCH, they provide you with a fraud interview form. I highly recommend that you use that form, and then you document each of these interviews on that form. Okay, so we've completed the interviews and we have those documented appropriately. What are we going to do with that information? We're going to have a discussion about how fraud might create a risk of material misstatement. So we get together as an audit team. Now the engagement partners required to be involved in this audit team discussion about fraud. And then the other key people on the audit team, they should be involved as well. We're going to brainstorm about how fraud might occur. So as we're having the audit team meeting, we might use a whiteboard, for example. And then on the whiteboard, if you're the engagement partner or you're the in charge, you would ask the people that are present, how do you think fraud could occur, and what's the most probable way that fraud might occur? And then based on those fraud interviews and the walkthroughs and your understanding of the entity, you're going to get a pretty good feel for the highest potential for fraud in the organization. Now, fraud can occur by cooking the books, and then the second way that fraud occurs is through theft. So you want to look at both of those perspectives. Or is there a potential where they might be cooking the books? Is there a potential for theft in the organization? And then once you identify the key areas that fraud might occur, then you want to document that on your risk assessment summary form. Now we've placed this risk of material misstatement in relation to fraud on our risk assessment summary form. And of course, the risk assessment summary form, we're trying to synthesize all of the potential risk and material misstatements so that we can plan and respond to the potential for material misstatements. If there's a risk, say, of a fictitious vendor, then I'm going to formulate procedures in my audit program that are responsive to that potential theft. And then I'm going to perform those substantive procedures to make sure the theft didn't occur in that manner. Let's look at this at a very high level. We're performing fraud interviews, we're required to, but also, and really more importantly, we're trying to identify the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. And then if we identify any of those risks, then we'll use that information to plan responses, substantive procedures, or a test of internal controls. We'll use that risk of fraud to plan our response. Hope that helps. Take care, and bye now.